morning and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. In the last couple of weeks, we have watched as one school or conference after another has decided not to play sports in the fall. The public relations ramifications are serious, and public relations professionals are paying attention to the language around those announcements and the impact those words can have on various stakeholders. My guest today is Steve Dittmore, who recently wrote about his observations on how schools are managing a looming crisis, the PR crisis. Steve has a very unique blend of sport industry practitioner experience with an academic background in both sport management and journalism and mass communications. He worked at two Olympic Games, both the Atlanta 1996 Games and the Salt Lake City Games in 2002. He has a PhD in educational leadership and organizational development from the University of Louisville, and he's currently a professor and assistant dean at the University of Arkansas. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Karen. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So before we dive into what we were supposed to talk about, we had news yesterday that broke about some interesting changes at Vanderbilt University. Can you bring our listeners up to speed on that?
Yes, I mean, Vanderbilt really hasn't publicly stated this yet, but it's been reported in the Tennessean and other media outlets that Vanderbilt is going to effectively do away with its athletic communications, or what has historically been known as the sports information department within its athletic department, and subsume those responsibilities into the university relations or the university communications area. This is kind of the first time you've really seen this, particularly at a Division I, Power 5, SEC type institution. These things typically operate very independently of one another, and so, needless to say, it's caused a lot of concern, consternation among folks that work in the athletic communication space.
And it's interesting because, if anything, athletics communications has enlarged over the last several years, primarily with the evolution of digital media and creating digital content. And so it's an interesting time to subsume an athletics communications office inside of a university communications office. Obviously, it has implications for those who are working in that department. You had some thoughts. One of them, of course, which is obvious, which is cutting salaries and cutting positions. But you also wonder if there's a time in this situation where they're perhaps trying to get a hold of their message. And this ties into what you wrote about in Athletic Director U. Do you think Vanderbilt wants to get a hold of the sports and pandemic message a little bit more tightly?
I don't know that. I mean, I don't have any firsthand knowledge or interaction with people at Vanderbilt, but I will say that Vanderbilt has been kind of a more progressive leader in terms of how it views athletics in relation to the overall mission of the university and of their student body and what they're trying to teach their students that attend there. Very, very different, certainly, from SEC institutions and state land grant type institutions, and much more aligned with what I think you would see at a Division III or in a liberal arts institution. I think of like the Ivy League and the Patriot League as institutions, as conferences rather, that kind of have a very different view as well about the role of athletics within higher education. I think Vanderbilt kind of strikes me as one of those that kind of stands out among those institutions at the Power 5 level that doesn't really necessarily beat to the same drum. So I don't know that it's necessarily about getting the message, controlling the message for the pandemic, so much as it is perhaps a way to streamline operations. You mentioned, they're doing the same things that virtually athletic communications is doing the same things that virtually every institution is doing on the education side, which is producing unique content, distributing it out on platforms to various stakeholders. And if Vanderbilt views athletic stakeholders as being the same as stakeholders for the campus at large, then maybe they want to be able to provide some consistency of messaging that way.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that. I mean, that's one of the things you talked about as your article was entitled How Schools Should Announce Their Decision to Discontinue Sports During the Pandemic. You wrote it for Athletic Director U, which is an online site that tries to provide just-in-time guidance for athletic directors about issues that they're facing. So it was a really appropriate article. And tell us a little bit about the research you've been doing.
Yeah, so I've been writing for ADU, as we call it, Athletic Director U, for a couple of years now. And try to provide, some thought pieces and try to look at it and provide guidance, as you said, to athletic administrators. And so what I did, I got this idea, and this plays kind of on my background as a communications person and a journalism major, and having worked in sport public relations for a number of years, tried to look at, well, how do athletic departments make this announcement? How do they go about creating messaging around what is, at the end of the day, a negative news story? Nobody wants to cut opportunities for student athletes. Nobody wants to eliminate coaches' positions. Nobody wants to eliminate the support personnel that go along with that. And so how do athletic departments do that? So what I did is I first of all, I delimited this to just the Division I schools. There's been 22 Division I schools that have announced program cuts or eliminations or suspensions, depending on the nature of the university, since the pandemic hit in mid-March, and tried to break down, looking at the messaging and seeing what kind of commonalities, what kind of themes might have emerged. Tried to use a theoretical framework to help guide those conclusions and those observations. And I think what you see at the end of the day is maybe some suggestions for best practices or things that athletic administrators certainly should be considering when they make these announcements, which at the end of the day are difficult to do in this environment in which everybody is dispersed. Nobody is there centrally. You can't look a student athlete in the eye in a room and be able to tell them, hey, this is why this happened. And so you've got to use the electronic medium as a way to do that. So that was kind of the purpose of what I set out to try and examine.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating article. So we've got a certain number of programs. I think you mentioned 22. Can you break those down for us? Was there any pattern that you found?
Yeah, I mean, so of the 22 institutions that have announced program cuts, there have been a total of 26. And I exclude from this Connecticut, which has made announcements that won't impact FY21, but they will impact FY22. But a total of 26 Division I programs on the men's side, 18 Division I programs on the women's side. Of those, 8 for both gender for tennis. Swimming and diving, there have been 3 swimming and diving, 2 male swimming and diving, 3 baseball programs that were cut, 3 indoor men's track and field programs, and then some, one-offs here and there, a men's lacrosse program, a cross-country program, a soccer program here, a softball program there. And so that kind of, shows you kind of the picture of what we're looking at. Now, I should say, too, that none of these programs have been cut by what we would consider the Power 5 schools. Some of them have been by Group of 5, some of them by what we would classify as FCS, and then some by, I think there's a couple in there that don't sponsor football. So, the traditional 1 AAA schools. And so what we find is, or what I observe is that early on, there was no real blame of the pandemic. Both Old Dominion, which announced on April 2nd that it was going to cut men's wrestling, and Cincinnati on April 14th that announced that it was going to cut men's soccer. Those were 2 things that they tried to position as considerations that they were engaged in, or conversations they were engaged in long before the pandemic hit. And as we go forward then into May, where you have many universities announcing things, and even into June, where we had a rash kind of toward the end of June, a lot of universities making decisions to cut, we see much more of this being attributable to the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the lost revenues. And there's a couple of ways to interpret that. And I think one of the things that I find about the messaging is that by blaming the pandemic for this, it effectively is saying, in some ways, we didn't have our financial affairs in order. We couldn't withstand, we don't have the big enough margins. We're so razor thin, we can't afford to have a loss of any amount of revenue. And so when that happens, we have to make cuts. We can't generate revenues elsewhere. And none of these schools chose to cut big revenue sports. Most of them chose to cut what we would consider Olympic sports, and very few of them cut sports where there's a large or the potential for a large spectator audience. The fact that a baseball program, or in case of Alabama, Huntsville, a men's ice hockey program, which they later reinstated after private funding allowed it to persist. But for the most part, these are things like golf and tennis and swimming and diving that don't, in track and field and cross country, that don't generate large spectator audiences.
Well, and for my listeners who have been also paying attention to the argument that many of those very same athletes bring tuition revenues to campus and in effect pay for them their own way and then some, we could get into another discussion about where those tuition revenues end up, but that's not where we're going to focus today. That'll be the topic of another podcast. But let's start with, where did the announcements, who were they directed to, the audience, and then what office did they come from on campus?
So, and that's a good question. And I didn't really truly, break down how many of them, at least in the article, how many of them were made by athletic directors versus presidents. Anecdotally here, I can tell you that for the most part, these announcements were attributable to the athletic director, although there was some reference to the president. I would say it was probably about a 2/3, 1/3 split on that, maybe even closer to 3/4 that were announced by the athletic department. And so what I did is I found the original news release or announcement that was made on the athletic website about this. And, I saved a copy of that locally as a PDF, and then, linked to it in the article to where those were still available. And I tried to look at, well, what was the messaging there? And it was clear that the audience that was for the actual news release is really just a traditional PR thing. We're going to put out this news release, we're going to disseminate this information, and these are the talking points that we're going to use. Several universities, and increasingly more as we saw time go on, also created a supplementary document that was what I call an FAQ, or a frequently asked questions document, that sought to really answer specific questions that the universities might have anticipated would be asked, or that they saw other universities addressing as well. Things like, will private fundraising help save these programs? Where should I go if I'm an athlete and I want to transfer? What kind of support services are available to me? Will my scholarship be offered? So in some respects, the FAQs really went at the specific audience of the athletes, because again, they're not able to meet with those individuals in person. And so this became an effective way to distribute that information. But for the most part, I think what the universities were doing was following the traditional guidelines of disseminating information and just sending it out to an audience that would historically be like a media audience or a stakeholder audience.
Yeah. Well, you talked about something that I hadn't heard of before, but it's a theory called the typology of image restoration, founded by William Benoit. Talk to us a little bit about this. What does that mean?
So the idea of Benoit's typology here, developed in the mid-90s, is that in instances of crisis or instances of negative news in which an organization needs to repair its image, there are 6 broad ways that organizations go about doing that. And then there's some sub-tactics that exist underneath those things. And it's really designed to, at its core, some of the suggestions in the typology includes mortification, apologies for this, we're sorry that this happened, and the theory is kind of grounded in corporate image repair. And so things like Exxon Valdez is kind of a precursor to this. What did Exxon do after the Valdez spilled oil into the ocean? And to look at those things. But it's a growing line of literature that has emerged within sports, because individuals and organizations do screw up in sports, and they have a need to apologize, or they have a need for what we would call corrective action to ensure that something like this isn't going to happen. And in this case, the approach that I used was to use this theory and this typology, but really it isn't in reaction to a negative occurrence, other than to be viewed negatively because they had to cut a sport. So in terms of how are we explaining the action that we are taking, which is undoubtedly a negative action and is going to be subject to criticism, is going to be subject to frustration. What sort of messaging are we using? And, there were some prominent things that, most organizations will try to do. They'll try to use what is known as a bolstering tactic, where we're going to talk about the things that we still do well, and bolster the positives and try to kind of minimize the impact of the negatives. So that was something that was used pretty prominently by a number of the institutions, was to talk about the things that were positive that they did. There was some other aspects to try and evade responsibility. Well, we really couldn't do anything. This was provoked by the pandemic. It wasn't our fault that we did this. We didn't want to. We were forced to do it. And then, the other one that I think is always very effective is to be able to provide some transcendence, some public, transparent information, and try to really look at things about allowing stakeholder questions and answers to be framed in a way that the athletic department wants, and put it into language that minimize the impact of the decision.
That's interesting. So let's take that down to a specific example that you use, which is Appalachian State. Walk us through what they did.
So App State cut 3 sports. They cut men's soccer, men's tennis, and men's indoor track. And the idea just of cutting indoor track is interesting because it doesn't really impact the overall number of participation opportunities as long as there's still outdoor track. It just shortens the competitive season from November through June to now being more or less March through June, and competing in outdoor track. But men's soccer and men's tennis. And so Appalachian State used this they were one of the first ones to really do an aggressive frequently asked question document, their Q&A document. And it allowed them to really position the university's decision relative to the larger institution and the structure that existed. It allowed them to answer questions about how does this impact fundraising? How does this impact ongoing construction projects that might be in play? And also, one of the things they stressed is that it more closely aligns the university with its peers in terms of its competition within their conference and other institutions that they might think of as that. And so by doing this, by using those kind of transcendent approaches, they I think came across better than some other institutions by the type of information they were disclosing, the transparent nature of how they were addressing some of this, and just being able to get their talking points across.
So let's flip it the other way. You noted that 2 schools from the Big Sky Conference tried to shift the blame. Can you walk us through what they did and why it may not work?
Well, and so in this instance, what happened is the Big Sky and the 2 schools you're alluding to are Northern Colorado and Southern Utah, both of which cut men's and women's tennis programs. What they did was, in their announcements, they cited a rule change from the Big Sky Conference, their parent conference, in which it changed the number of sports that the institution must sponsor in order to maintain membership within the conference. So it provided more flexibility to the institutions. And so by doing that, I think my interpretation of what UNC and Southern Utah were doing was shifting the blame and saying, well, in a way, Big Sky prompted this because they changed their rules, and that allows us to do this. And still maintain our membership in the institution. So it's kind of an evade responsibility and shift the blame type of approach. And I guess I should walk back one thing. These approaches are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, most organizations use a number of tactics in their announcements. So just about every organization tried to bolster it in some fashion, but others used differing tactics like shift the blame or evade responsibility alongside the bolstering approach.
One of the things you mentioned in the article was about this business of nuances in headlines and the concept of quote unquote reducing offensiveness. Mm-hmm. Explain to senior leaders in higher education who may be contacted by an upset parent or an athlete how verbal messaging works and how to communicate difficult news in person. in
Yeah.
2 minutes or less.
Sure. Well, so one of the things that struck me was that five institutions, Central Michigan, East Carolina, Appalachian State, Wright State, and Boise State, use the exact same headline for their news release, which was the university, Boise or Central Michigan, whatever, athletics announces program change. So it's a pretty benign description. Um, it is summarizes what is taking place, and I make the comment that it wasn't likely to cause an immediate visceral reaction because a program change. Well, that could be any number of things, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that a sport's being eliminated. Whereas universities that did state something like that in their headline um, chose really not to use words like cut or eliminate, but rather the kind of less offensive discontinue, which doesn't sound as finite or as violent, I guess, as cut or eliminate. A couple other universities announced that they were suspending their programs, which is a little different. Discontinue means that we're not going to have this going forward. There's really no hope. Suspend is, well, we're going to pull the plug on it for a year and see where we are a year from now with regard to our finances. But indefinitely suspended could often translate into permanent discontinuance. So, yeah, I think there is some nuance in language that how words are used, particularly in an environment where you can't see nonverbal reactions. It's very two-dimensional in this announcement. It's black and white. It's what is printed there. And unfortunately, as a society, we've all evolved into being very reactionary toward things and not really holding out for explanation and interpretation. We just choose to immediately go somewhere based on our worldview and say, oh, well, this has to be. So it's even more important, I think, in that time to really be able to present an language and a message that is in what the university wants, that puts as positive of an approach as they possibly can on what is just a really negative overall news story and decision.
I really have to echo that because as I've tracked on the COVID-19 updates on various university and athletic department websites, I've noticed that it's not, fall sports to be canceled. It's COVID-19 update. And then you have to look at the actual date it was posted to see how recent that update has been. Any thoughts on why universities are taking that tact?
So I would say that universities and athletic departments in particular are so reliant on private giving. So alums, donors, people to support their endeavors, whether it's on the academic side of the house or the athletic side of the house, that I think there is I have no evidence to support this other than my own gut feeling, but that there is a fear that if a university comes out ahead of the curve on something and makes a decision, that people are going to immediately have a negative reaction to it. And so by blaming or shifting the blame or evading the responsibility by saying, well, this isn't really what we want to do, but it's what we're forced to do because of COVID-19 and COVID-19 this and COVID-19 that, it softens it somewhat, I think. I think that the average person says, okay, yeah, I get it. This has impacted all of life and I can see where that's coming from. But, kind of taking it back to some of the things I observed, not every athletic department included language about the pandemic or COVID-19 as its reasons for discontinuing or making its decision, which suggests to me that maybe it was just a convenient reason to do that. Maybe they were thinking all along, well, we're going to get rid of this men's and women's golf program, or we're going to get rid of indoor track. And this just was the catalyst that allowed us to do that. So that's my reaction, I guess.
I mean, there's certainly been a sentiment around these, especially when programs like Cincinnati and Old Dominion initially dropped their teams, that, they're just using the pandemic as an excuse to either put more money into football or to, account for their salaries or those kinds of things. But I think that we're at that point now, especially this week, with sort of the tipping point of having to make decisions about either A, whether you're coming back in full, B, you're coming back just with a conference schedule, C, you're not coming back at all, or D, you're going to bring back a certain group of athletes and not another group of athletes. This nuancing around messaging is going to be really important.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think, one of the things you just said there reminds me of something else that we observed in this, or that I wrote about, which is the idea that, these athletic departments that had the message about, the I'm trying to find the exact language that I used here so that what they're saying is that, like Southern Utah, here it is. I've got it in front of me now. Southern Utah made the statement, quote, now that tennis is gone, we can make the experience better for our remaining athletes. Well, I read that. Excuse me. That's what I read with their statement that said, their statement was that Southern Utah could now focus its available resources on the remaining 15 sports and provide a more competitive experience to the student athletes. What I interpreted that was that now that tennis is gone, we can make this a better experience for our remaining athletes.
Yeah.
Which I think is not what they intended, but by saying, well, we're going to really support these other sports and create a better experience for existing student athletes, I think what they're doing is slapping those other student athletes on the backside on the way out and saying, well, thanks for coming, but you really didn't contribute to this. Furman did the same thing, where it said, we're going to push forward together with a strong 18-sport athletics department that demonstrates academic excellence, financial stability, gender equity, and sustainable competitive success. As if baseball and lacrosse were not contributing to those things, that they were not helping with academic excellence or financial stability or gender equity. And so I think universities need to be careful with that language so that it doesn't backfire and it doesn't get misconstrued or misinterpreted somehow.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, because you could also be looking at donors. You could be offending by those comments who wanted to support the baseball or lacrosse or tennis or golf programs. They could be like, well, then, I'm going to cut my affiliation completely with the university at this point.
Yeah, and you saw that a little bit with Bowling Green and Alabama Huntsville, which were able to generate enough private donations to allow those programs to be reinstated, at least on a temporary basis. And this was another conclusion. Some athletic departments in their frequently asked questions addressed that head on and said, nope, this isn't going to be an option. I don't care how much money you can come up with, cross country is not coming back, and here's why.
Yeah, and it's part of the FAQs that you talked about earlier.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So a number of the folks who listen to this podcast regularly are folks who either aspire to be a president, are in their first presidency, or perhaps are new trustees on a college or university board of directors. What kinds of advice would you give to them about navigating these difficult waters around taking away opportunities at this time? Nobody likes to take away opportunities from students. So what kinds of things can they learn from this research that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a larger picture here, which is, cutting certain sports that do generate participation opportunities while simultaneously generating revenue through tuition and student enrollment. Taking away those opportunities, I think, is problematic for the university. I mean, students go to campus to continue or to create an identity. And if I'm a high school athlete and I play lacrosse and I'm not ready as an 18-year-old to lose my lacrosse identity, but I want to go to college and I want to continue that, there are avenues for that individual, whether it's NAIA schools or Division III or Division II. But there are avenues to continue that, much like, universities create majors, they create other extracurricular activities that appeal to a certain audience and a certain demographic. And, students that play the trombone want to continue playing the trombone. And so they go to college and they become part of the marching band, or they become part of the choral, the choir or something like that, to continue singing. So taking away those opportunities in sports is, I think, problematic for the larger university. So, I mean, Furman was one of these that I think really stuck out to me, because Furman is a small campus, less than 1,000 total male students on their campus, just under 1,000 male students. And they cut, or right around 1,000, they cut 90 some odd male athlete participation opportunities between baseball and lacrosse. That's like taking one of every 12 male students. Sorry, you don't get to come here and do that. You can still come here and pay your tuition, but your reason or your identity for being on campus is going to be taken away in some respect.
Yeah, yeah. These are really complex decisions. And I think the messaging around it becomes so crucial, not only to university, the students who remain behind, but also just to the university's reputation, because this process can really damage a university's reputation if it's not handled correctly. Steve, anything else that you can think of that our audience should know about this?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come on and speak. It's great to reconnect with you. I know we've crossed paths over the last decade or so in this business, but it's great to reconnect.
Absolutely. Steve Ditmore, thanks so much.
Thank you, Karen.